Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Several times a month I get some questions about, do I ever make a Quilt As You Go project? And can I show you how to make a Quilt As You Go project? And when I do show a couple of them, like I showed you guys previously how to do a table runner, a really quick and simple Quilt As You Go Christmas table runner, but I haven't done too many actual large quilts. So I thought we'd just go ahead and start a new series, and I would go ahead and show you a Quilt As You Go simple quilt. Now every few weeks I see different projects on Pinterest, online, on Instagram and Facebook of the herringbone project, the herringbone quilts. I've always loved the herringbone design on the quilts, and I've wanted to make one myself, but some of the tutorials are a little bit complex, and sometimes you're using a little bit more waste fabric than I'm interested in, and everything needs to be exact and precise and all your points line up. And if you've been here with me for a while, you know I'm not really into having everything line up precisely. I just kind of like that whole scrappy fun bit of it. I can do precise, but I have to slow down and I have to go step by step and go and really ease into it and be very careful what I'm doing. I'd rather just sit down and sew and have fun with my scraps and not really have to worry if everything goes together perfectly. My seams don't need to match up. Plus, it kind of reduces a lot of that bulk in your quilt if they don't. I recently saw a blog post about making a scrappy herringbone quilt, but they did it as a Quilt As You Go. Now, we're going to be doing the same thing, but I'm going to be doing it a little bit different than her. This quilter, she did it where she made her quilts into one long column, and then she only had like 4 or 5 columns of her quilt to make, where I wanted to do mine more in blocks. And hers all lined up nicely and all her points matched, and she had that nice little zigzag going, similar to the way, the way the herringbone goes. It's not actually a zigzag because it has more of the 45-degree angle to it. But like I said, I didn't want to worry about my points, and I didn't want to have to deal with like a 60-inch long strip of batting. I just wanted to make a couple and then step away from it for a while, make a few more, and just work on it like I did my crumb blocks. Do a little bit every day, every couple days, once a week, twice a month, however I wanted to do it, until I had enough blocks or to make one quilt, or maybe enough blocks to make 3 or 4, depending on how crazy I go when I'm making these. Now, a lot of times when you're doing the Quilt As You Go blocks, you're going to have your fabrics on top, then you're going to have a cotton batting. You need to have 100% cotton batting because you're going to be doing a lot of pressing with your iron, and you really can't put a hot iron onto the polyester. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking our fabric, and this is just totally random, but we're going to be putting a strip of fabric down onto our batting. We'll be taking another strip, stitching it down and pushing it over, and we're going to iron every time. So we're going to constantly be putting our iron against our batting. If you're using polyester, it will definitely melt. And I'm sure it'll probably smell real bad too. So I've been doing mine with no backing and 100% cotton batting. I will be adding a large backing to it like you would on a normal quilt after all of my blocks are done and that they're all stitched together. Just to give you a little peek to the end, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking 2 blocks, just like you would when you normally quilt, and I will be stitching them together. I haven't decided if I'm going to do a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch yet. And then you'll press them open, and then they'll be connected like a normal block. A lot of times when you do the Quilt As You Go, they put an extra piece of, like a piece of sashing fabric in there, and that's really not going to work for a herringbone quilt. But doing it this way, like I said, we'll just be able to sew. We won't have to be able to think, we won't be thinking too much, and the process is going to go rather quickly, just like when we're doing any type of string blocks or crumb blocks, if you've done those in the past. So this week, I'm just going to get you a head start on some of the supplies you need, so you can start, if you want to quilt along with me, you can go ahead and start getting your supplies all prepped and ready. Otherwise, you can just come back each week and see the progress, and then go ahead and make your quilt whenever you want to. I took all my leftover batting scraps and strips and chunks that I had left over in my little laundry basket where I store them. They're left over for when you trim down the side of a quilt, or let's say you're using a twin size roll of batting but you're only making a baby size quilt, so there's always chunks left over. I save all those. Anything that's, actually I save anything that's at least 1 inch wide, because those can be used for key fobs or in purse handles. So generally I save almost every piece of batting that's left over. I went ahead and made 25 of these rectangles to start with, and 5 of them were fully all in one chunk, and I just had to cut out the size I needed and I didn't worry about it. But the rest of them, I took all my different chunks, and as you can see I have 1, 2, 3 seam lines on this one. I'm going to go ahead and link up to the video where I show how I Franken-piece batting. And you would think that this would actually take a while, but what I did is I just laid them out on my cutting table, and I went and trimmed up one side so that I had that one straight edge to put another piece to. So if I took 50 pieces and I trimmed them all on one side, I didn't have to worry about the other side because I would just put these two together. And then when I trimmed up my block to the size I wanted, these two edges would get trimmed. So I lined them all up relatively by size. I put some larger chunks, and then I put my medium chunks, and then my thinner ones. Because sometimes I only needed a little piece put in, and sometimes I used my big chunks. Now I decided I wanted my blocks to be 6.5 inches by 12.5 inches. I think when I was looking at that one blog that they used 6.5 inches wide for their big long column, but I went ahead with 12.5 inches because I have one of those square rulers that are 12.5 inches wide. And you know, a lot of blocks in quilting are 12.5 inches, so that seemed reasonable for me. If you've ever done string blocks, you know that you always have these extra pieces hanging over. And a lot of times when you do this type of quilting, you do it right onto paper. Like if you're making those square string blocks, you do them right onto the foundation paper and stitch right through the paper. And it's okay if your paper shrinks up and gets a little out of shape, because you're going to be removing that paper. Now, since I'm doing this Quilt As You Go, I'm not going to be removing my batting. So I wanted to make sure that, since it's cotton batting and as I'm stitching it, to make sure nothing shrunk in, I needed to make sure I could get my 6.5 by 12.5 inch block. So when I made my scrappy batting, my goal was to have it an inch bigger on each side. So my goal was to have it 7.5 inches by 13.5 inches. That gave me definitely an extra bit in case it shrinks, but now sometimes I didn't quite get to 13.5, maybe I got to 13.25. That still gave me plenty. As long as I had at least a ½ inch larger all the way around, then it was okay. My goal was an inch larger, so I pieced them the best I could. Sometimes, as you can see, I have this little chunk cut out, but because I'm going to be trimming it down after I piece all my fabric onto these blocks, it's okay because those pieces will be trimmed down. It just so happens that I'm short a little here, and I got a little extra here. I don't know, craziness. Now, the other thing I did is I went up into my fabric stash, and I have tons of novelty fabric. Just these fun little cute fabrics that they have designs on them, pictures all over it. It's quite a variety of them, and I took all of the ones I have because I had just had 2 stacks left in there. I've gone through a lot of this fabric. And what I did is I pulled it out, and if I had a small chunk, I just put that over on my ironing table. And if I had a larger piece, like maybe I still had a ½ yard, I went ahead and just cut a chunk off of it, like maybe about the size of a fat quarter, somewhere around the 18 to 22 inches. Because when we're piecing this, we're going to have some on the diagonal, and they're going to be, you need to have them an extra. If this is 6.5, but it's on the diagonal, you might need it to be 12 or 14 inches long. So I wanted to make sure I had some strips that were long enough to cover those diagonals. Now I also had some strips that were small, and I wasn't worried about that because I saved those because we will be putting some down at the bottom. So you can have a variety of lengths, but you want to see if you can have some that are extra long. If you don't have any scraps that are going to be 14 inches long, you can take the same fabric and put them together, stitch them together like you would with batting. You can put them on the straight like this, or you can stitch them and have a diagonal line like you're batting like this, or you can even just take 2 different fabrics and stitch them together. It all depends on what you're going to look for. Now I wanted one solid fabric, so if mine weren't long enough, I would have stitched the same fabric together, but I had plenty of scraps that I didn't have to worry about that. We'll see how it goes as I get going on. I'll show you next week how I cut them, but basically what I did is I just made sure all of my fabric was nice and pressed straight and nice and flat, so I didn't have to worry about it. I trimmed up one edge so I had a good edge to trim to start cutting my strips from. And then I just went crazy. I decided I didn't want any strips that were more than 3 inches long. So I do have some wider strips in here. And then I cut them down to about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. So I have some narrower strips. And that gives me a good variety when I'm putting them into my blocks. So that way my seams won't be lining up. You can decide that you want yours to be all 2.5 inches, and that's perfectly fine. This is your quilt. You can cut it up any way you want. Like I said, I've got some fat and I've got some narrow and I've got everything in between. So I was just cutting, and I'd cut one at 2.5. I'd just take that fat quarter and I cut it at 2.5. Then I'd cut maybe 1.5. Then I went and cut at 1 3/4, 2 1/4, and I just kept going down to the end of my fabric. And I took all of those strips and I just stuck them inside this basket. I mixed them all up. I put them in my chair and I tossed them all around and I stuck them in here. And as I'm making each block, I'll just pull the fabric out, and hopefully I won't have to put too many back in, because I might not want to have 2 quilts. Once you get going, it's going to change. Like, just because this block, if we count the fabrics up, 1 2 3, so we have this one here, but this one 1 2 3 is down here in the corner. I know these two, let me see. Once you get going, grabbing 2 of the same fabrics won't be as big of a deal. I did try to throw them back in. I didn't want to have 2 blocks the same. But if you've noticed, I have 1 2 3. And then this is the black with the hearts. But over here, I have this little corner. Didn't pay attention when I was doing that, obviously. So I got 1 2 3, and it's the dogs. Now these will line up here. But as we get going and they get wider, our strips are no longer lining up, because we have different widths on each block. Now, not every block did I do a 2 inch, a 2 1/4, a 2.5, 2 3/4. I just randomly grabbed them. Now you can see there's also white strips in these. Now this block happens to have 2 white strips, and this one only has 1. I decided that I wanted to put 1 to 3 of these strips of white randomly in each block. I cut these strips at 1.5 so that they would finish down at 1 inch once I put them in the block. And I thought that would help just kind of break up the whole mess of it, kind of give your eye just a little bit of a rest, and kind of just give a little more interest to my quilt blocks. I actually cut my white from yardage, and then I just take a strip and I keep adding it on wherever I feel like it. I trim off the excess and then use that for the next block. I am using, currently right now, I'm using this baby blue, light blue thread. I've spoken before on how I've switched to a different brand of thread, and I have some of these older threads from, I believe it's the Coates and Clark brand. And now it's a great thread, but I just wanted something in a larger spool. So I have all these different smaller spools of thread left over. So I've just been using them as my string quilts so that I'm not going through my good thread, and I'm just using up some of these old spools so that I don't have them sitting in my stash still. So I'm using I got leftover batting, I got leftover bits of fabric. Some of them can be from a scrap container, or I cut it actually off of some small chunks of yardage, and then I have my scrappy thread. The reason I went into my stash to pull out some yardage and some fat quarters is I've actually used up 90% of my scraps on my crumb blocks for my crumb curtain. So I'm actually out of scraps, which is kind of crazy to hear. I do have some smaller chunks of fabric that are less than a fat quarter that I still need to trim up, but my actual little bits and pieces left over from projects like that, the smaller ones, I've used them all up. So I went ahead and I just pulled them all out, and this way I know I'm getting a good variety, because I pulled out probably about 25 or 30 fabrics, and hopefully I won't have too many similar blocks. So if doing a scrappy herringbone quilt as you go project sounds like fun to you and you'd like to go ahead and stitch along with me, gather up your supplies, and when I come back next week, I will go ahead and I'll show you how I cut the fabric, and then I'll go ahead and show you how I stitch it down onto my batting pieces. Until next week, happy scrapping, and I'll see you later. Bye!